The quiet coastal town of Bayport, as if frozen in time, caressed the ear with the rhythmic whisper of the waves and the rare cries of seagulls. Its streets, paved with weathered slabs, were cozily framed by old houses that held the secrets of generations. Here everyone knew his neighbor, and gossip was passed on faster than the wind. Life in Bayport seemed to flow in a measured and predictable way, but beneath the surface lurked unbreakable and dark passions. Margaret Wilson walked down the main street, her light steps barely audible on the damp sidewalk. Her beauty attracted the eye. Long, dark hair braided in an elegant braid and expressive brown eyes in which one could see a shadow of longing. She seemed to be the perfect wife of a successful lawyer, but her inner loneliness was devouring her day by day. The eyes of the townspeople glided over her with curiosity and envy, but no one guessed the abyss inside her soul. Richard Wilson, her husband, was known for his unwavering rigor and professionalism. His clients feared and respected him for his ability to tear apart any opposition in the courtroom. At home, he turned into an emotionless statue where words were rare and gestures were tools of control. His cold calm had once attracted Margaret, seeming to her a symbol of reliability and strength. But over time, it had become chains that shackled her desire to live life to the fullest. She remembered their first years together, when everything had seemed new and exciting. But the years had taken away the warmth, leaving only cold glances and short phrases. Margaret had fallen into a routine where every day was like the last. Her world became books and quiet music which only temporarily dulled her sadness. The bright spot in her day was Thomas Gray, a charming builder who was busy with renovation projects on local buildings. His arrival in Margaret's life was an accident, but their conversations about painting, history, and dreams quickly grew into something more. Thomas, with his simple humor and genuine consideration, was the complete opposite of Richard. With him, Margaret could feel like herself. She couldn't remember the last time she had laughed as heartily as she had with him. "How was your day, Margaret?" Thomas stopped in front of one of the old houses where they had agreed to meet. His smile was warm, his eyes shining with amusement. She smiled with the edge of her lips and replied, "The same as always. Home, books, endless emptiness." Their conversations were full of undertones and understatements. Margaret was wary of opening up completely, but the sparks between them rekindled with every glance. Thomas understood her half-heartedly, seeing how hard it was for her to hide her feelings. He didn't ask too many questions, letting her decide when and what to say. Richard sat in his study. The pale light of the lamp illuminated the stack of papers and the stern lines of his face. He was working on a complex corruption case involving a number of local businessmen. His life outside of work seemed monotonous, but he knew Bayport hid much more than quiet streets and the cries of seagulls. In the back of his mind, he felt his well-being hanging in the balance. "Richard, why don't we take a break and have dinner together?" Margaret suggested one day, standing at the study door. She searched his eyes for a drop of his former warmth, but her expectations were in vain. He looked up at his wife, and a shadow of irritation flashed in his eyes. "I'm busy, don't disturb me." Margaret stepped back, feeling the coldness of his words penetrate her heart. In these moments, she remembered Thomas and their secret walks through the evening streets. They had been her salvation, the place where she could feel warmth and a living connection with someone. Walks along the coast, where the air was saturated with salt and freedom, were her best memories of the last few years. Emma, her friend from high school, noticed the change in Margaret. Being outgoing and witty, Emma often visited her with a smile and jokes, but sensed something was wrong. She was one of the few who had known Margaret from a young age, and could discern genuine moods beneath the mask of calm. "You have become brooding, Margaret. Are Richard's affairs weighing so heavily on you?" Emma asked, sipping tea in the drawing room, where the soft light of the lamp made the setting cozy. "It's just fatigue, Emma. It'll pass." Margaret was good at hiding her pain, but her eyes gave it away. She avoided her friend's gaze, afraid she would read the truth in them. Frank, Richard's co-worker and an old family friend, sometimes dropped by for dinner. His presence always added a note of tension to the air. He, unlike Richard, was gregarious and easily found topics of conversation, But despite his friendly tone, Margaret noticed Frank watching her closely, as if trying to read her mind. He was too perceptive and had a knack for noticing details that others missed. One evening, on her way home from a meeting with Thomas, Margaret noticed the curtains in Richard's study flutter open. He stood behind them, staring into the void, but it seemed to Margaret that his gaze was piercing her through. A tingling sense of unease crept into her soul. She knew Richard suspected her, but she didn't know how far his suspicions went. "Thomas, I don't know how long I can live like this," she whispered, as she met him at the old lookout on the edge of town. From here they had a view of the bay that seemed vast and free. He squeezed her hand and looked into her eyes. "We'll find a way out, Margaret. I promise." Those words, filled with confident hope, were like a lifeline to her. Each day her resolve grew stronger. She knew that changing her life wouldn't be easy, but she also realized she couldn't live the way she was living now any longer. Outside, Bayport was still as quiet and picturesque as ever, but inside Margaret's soul was a storm that would sooner or later erupt. Margaret Wilson's inner world was increasingly filled with fear and growing anxiety. 1,000 thoughts swirled in her head as she tried to figure out how long she could continue her double life and what she would have to do to break the chains Richard had so skillfully thrown on her. Doubt and remorse plagued her, but every time she met Thomas's gaze, she felt a surge of determination. He was the embodiment of hope, but also the source of new fears. Thomas Gray had seemed restless in recent days. He knew that the situation with Richard could escalate at any moment. Despite his charm and confidence, he realized that the darker sides of Bayport were not forgiving of mistakes. Too many people knew more about each other than they should, and one wrong move could ruin everything. He'd told Margaret more than once about the need to make a decision. "You need to think about your future, Margaret. We can't live like this forever," Thomas said as they met in a hidden part of the city park. The trees rustled in the light breeze, and the shadows seemed longer than usual. "I know, Thomas, but fear is holding me back." Her voice trembled. "If Richard finds out—" Thomas leaned closer, peering into her eyes. "We will do this the right way. I won't let you suffer." A long silence hung between them, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of cars. Margaret couldn't help but think of the consequences. Every word Thomas spoke awakened in her a wave of fear and hope at the same time. She knew change was inevitable, but at what cost would it come? Meanwhile, Richard Wilson went about his work with even more focus. The corruption case he was working on was becoming more and more convoluted. The number of people involved was growing, and the threat they posed was becoming clear. Each new piece of evidence pushed him toward a discovery that could turn the lives of not only him, but the entire city's elite upside down. Frank, his colleague and old friend, would often drop by the office, bringing the latest news and new details. "Do you think we're getting closer to a clue?" Frank asked, sitting down across from Richard. His voice sounded tired and his eyes were wary. "I think so. But if we make a mistake, we'll all be crushed," Richard replied with icy certainty. Frank nodded silently, but there was a flicker of worry in his eyes. He had known Richard for a long time, and he had seen him change under the pressure of his environment. The work that had once brought him satisfaction was now a source of endless stress. Late nights at the Wilson house became increasingly tense. Richard noticed how detached Margaret had become, how her gaze wandered somewhere in the distance. Her silence irritated him, fueling an inner suspicion that gradually grew into paranoia. "Margaret, are you hiding something from me?" His voice was cold as steel. He stood at the window, looking out at the evening city and the twinkling lights of cars. She flinched as she heard his words and met his gaze. A shadow of fear ran across her face, but she quickly pulled herself together. "What are you talking about, Richard? I'm tired, just tired." He stepped closer, his eyes fixed on her as if he were trying to penetrate to the very depths of her soul. His face was a mixture of irritation and confusion. "Don't lie to me, Margaret. I can feel that something is wrong." At that moment, the thought of Thomas flashed through her mind, and her heart began to race. She tried to remain calm, but the feeling that Richard knew something made her more anxious. She felt as if the walls of the house were shrinking, that every rustle was giving her away. Thomas, too, was restless. He realized that Margaret faced a difficult choice. He saw her eyes fill with longing and heard the tremor in her voice as she recounted what was happening in the house. He knew she would have to go through a trial to be together. "We can change things, Margaret. You just have to make up your mind." His voice was confident and firm. His words sounded simple, but behind them was an abyss of decisions and consequences. He realized that her fears were real and that in this game, every move could be fatal. One night, as Richard lingered in the study, Margaret sat at the bedroom window, looking out at the flickering lanterns and the light of the moon pouring over the calm surface of the bay. She felt that life was slipping into an abyss, and she needed to make a decision before it was too late. Scenes of the future rose in front of her inner gaze, one with Thomas and freedom, the other with the hopelessness in which she would continue to live under Richard's gaze. That same evening, walking outside, she met Thomas at the corner of their familiar road. He was waiting for her in the shade of a large oak tree, and his figure seemed even more tense than usual. "What's wrong?" he asked, seeing her worried look. "I don't know how much longer I can hold out." Her voice shook, but she tried to sound confident. Richard was beginning to suspect something. Thomas looked at her seriously. "Then we must act quickly. We don't have time." Those words made her inner world turn upside down. She realized that this moment was a point of no return. Every day the risk grew, and she felt that soon she would not be able to hide from Richard or herself. In the Wilson home, tension was at its peak. Richard withdrew more and more into himself, while intensifying his surveillance of his wife's every move. He no longer trusted anyone, including Frank. One night, when Margaret thought he was asleep, Richard quietly got up and went to the study to look through papers and records that might explain his anxiety. Margaret awoke to the sound of footsteps and held her breath, realizing that the game they had been playing was coming to its finale. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she knew that soon everything would change. The tension in the Wilson household had reached a breaking point. Margaret could no longer ignore the signs that were becoming clearer by the day. Richard had become not just suspicious, but openly vigilant. His gaze was wary, his footsteps quiet, and his appearance in unexpected places was a challenge to her. It was as if he had become a predator, ready to lunge at any moment. "I can't go on like this," she whispered to herself one evening, sitting on her bed, staring out at the dusky silhouette of the bay outside the window. Her hands were trembling, and her heart was beating like it was ready to burst out of her chest. She became more and more convinced that only decisive action could restore her freedom. Each day spent waiting seemed endless. Memories of quiet moments with Thomas, of his words full of reassurance and support, surfaced in her mind, spurring her to action. Those moments had been like a ray of light in her dark world, but even they were beginning to fade under the weight of danger. Thomas, too, was on edge. His anxiety became more noticeable, and he avoided unnecessary meetings and conversations with co-workers, fearing that any hint of his association with Margaret could be fatal. One day he wrote her a note, short and direct. "We must talk, it's urgent." They met at the old wharf, where the rustle of the water and the slight creak of the planks provided the only shelter for their secret. "Are you sure?" Thomas looked at her carefully, excitement and anxiety in his gaze at the same time. "Yes, there is no other way out. He won't stop," Margaret replied, her voice firm but her hands still trembling. "We'll get through this. The important thing is to follow the plan." Thomas tried to reassure her, but he could feel the tension pulling at his veins, turning every second into an eternity. That night, when Margaret returned home, she noticed she was being watched. It seemed to her that the shadows along the house had come alive, that every sound was amplified in her ears to a frightening hum. She turned around and saw a shadow in the window. Richard was standing there, not moving, watching her. It wasn't just the look of a husband. It was the look of a man ready to learn the truth at any cost. From that moment, her heart beat alarmingly without ceasing. The following days became a nervous waiting. Margaret's every move was considered to the smallest detail, every glance a mask of calm. She began to carefully plan her steps, hiding notes and traces that might lead to her secret. Her meetings with Thomas became even more secretive, and her conversations became filled with details that they discussed to the last detail. The two of them made a plan together, every part of it sounding like a vow of survival. One night, Richard decided to follow her. He realized that something was going on, and his patience was running out. When Margaret left the house, dressed in a simple cloak and with a look of nonchalance, Richard slipped out following. Her path took her through the center of town to a small park where Thomas was waiting for her. "He's watching me, Thomas. I saw him at the window today," Margaret said, her voice trembling but her eyes burning with determination. "We must end this before he exposes us. We have a deal, Margaret. Are you ready?" She nodded silently, but inside her everything trembled with fear. Thomas saw this, and though his face remained calm, he felt the same shaking emptiness inside. He knew it was too late to retreat. Richard, hidden behind the trees, watched what was happening. He couldn't hear all the words, but the expression on their faces and the tense gestures left no doubt. His jaw clenched and the blood rushed to his temples. He returned home without a word, but anger and jealousy were burning him from the inside out. It was going to be a long night. That night, when Richard came home, he found a silence that seemed too droning. There was a faint odor of lavender oil in the hallway, the kind Margaret liked to add to her water before bed. He closed the door behind him, and the next moment, everything was plunged into darkness. Margaret knew there was no time for doubt. She stepped into the study where Richard was waiting for her. Her husband's dark eyes met hers, and in that gaze was everything: rage, pain, suspicion. He wouldn't let her speak, but she took a step toward him and whispered, "I'm sorry, but it had to be done." The next morning, when his body was found in his office, a wave of rumors swept the city. The details of the crime indicated it had been carefully planned. No signs of a struggle, no obvious clues. The town whispered, discussing possible motives and suspects, but no one could guess that the real drama was taking place behind closed doors. Frank, Richard's co-worker, was one of the first to know what had happened. His face turned pale and his eyes glistened with surprise and horror. He guessed that there was more behind this murder than a simple case. His intuition told him that the truth lay deeper than it seemed. Emma, Margaret's friend, noticed the change in her. The way her compressed lips grew even thinner, the way her eyes lost their former softness. Margaret tried to keep a semblance of control, but at times her hands began to tremble. She looked out the window, seeing there the reflection of a woman who could no longer return to her past life. But neither could Emma. The truth was closer than anyone could have imagined. The town was alive with rumors, and behind closed doors the real drama was unfolding, hidden under the cover of the morning fog. The sun was rising over Bayport, coloring its streets a pale, golden hue. The streets were almost empty, but an atmosphere of tension hung in the air. There was an oppressive silence in the Wilson house, broken only by the whisper of the wind outside the window and the footsteps of the police officers arriving to inspect the crime scene. Detective Peter Hart, a man with sharp eyes and a strong-willed chin, stood in the center of the study, watching every corner of the room. His gaze clung to every detail: the neatly arranged books, the glass of whiskey on the table, the shoe tracks disappearing by the door. Peter was known for his analytical nature and attention to detail. His colleague, Lily Rose, stood nearby. Jotting down notes in a small notebook, Lily had a quiet confidence and insight that often led to unexpected conclusions. "Peter, look at this," Lily said, pointing to a thin scratch on the windowsill. "It looks as if someone had opened the window recently." "Interesting," Hart replied, nodding. "First we'll look at the surveillance tapes if there are any nearby." Hart walked over to the table and examined the glass with the rest of the whiskey. He leaned over to sniff the liquid, noting its strong flavor. "He was drinking before he died," he said thoughtfully. "Or that's what someone wanted us to think," Lily added, looking up. Margaret was sitting in the living room, her hands clenched so tightly that the joints turned white. Her face maintained a semblance of calm, but inside her, a storm was raging. Memories of that night persistently surfaced in her mind. making her shiver. She knew she had to hold on, or everything would come to light. The detectives began interviewing neighbors and friends. Questions poured in on everyone. Who saw what, who left, and came when. Emma came to support her friend, but she couldn't hide her concern. "It's so awful," she whispered, squeezing Margaret's shoulder. "Are you holding on?" "Yes, Emma. Thank you for coming," Margaret replied, pulling on a weak smile. There was a slight falseness in her voice that only Emma could detect. Meanwhile, Thomas Gray was doing his best to keep a low profile. He kept his hands shaking and kept his distance, hoping his presence wouldn't attract the detective's attention. Deep down, however, he knew that if the case turned against them, there would be no way out. Thomas often caught himself thinking that his eyes were searching for Peter and Lily, watching their movements and reactions. Every look from the detectives seemed like a judgment. Peter and Lily continued to gather evidence. The questions they asked were simple, but it was these simple details that often led to great discoveries. "Where were you last night?" Hart asked Margaret, looking at her with sharp eyes. "I went to bed early." Her voice was steady but a little strained. "I had a migraine." Lily wrote down her answer but exchanged a look of incomprehension with Peter. The evidence was scattered so far, but each new fact brought them closer to the truth. Peter saw Margaret's gaze waver as he asked the next question. "Did your husband have any enemies? Someone who might have wished him harm?" Margaret averted her eyes, trying to pretend she was thinking about the answer. "He was a lawyer," she said, struggling to keep her composure. There were always people in his line of work who were unhappy with the outcome of cases. Peter noticed her fingers playing nervously with the edge of her handkerchief and made a note in his notebook. Lily, sitting a little further away, watched Margaret's every movement carefully, noting her facial expressions and postures. In the evening, after a long day of questioning, Peter sat in his office reviewing the materials he had collected. One little thing kept him on his toes: fingerprints on the windowsill and marks on the carpet that could indicate a hidden presence. The detective's gaze stopped on a photograph taken at the crime scene. A thin shoe print, barely visible on the carpet, seemed familiar to him. Lily walked into the office with a cup of coffee and sat across from him. Her gaze was tired but still sharp. "Something doesn't add up," he said, handing her a sheet of notes. "There are too many coincidences for a simple robbery or random attack." "Do you think someone close to the family?" Lily asked quietly. Peter nodded, picking his words. "There are too many hidden threads around. Someone knows more than they're saying, and we need to find out who." Margaret spent the rest of the day alone, feeling her nerves fraying under the onslaught of questions and secret glances. She stared in the mirror, seeing her eyes lose their former confidence. The fear of exposure was eating her from the inside out. Thomas, too, felt that time was working against them, and every step they took could be their last. In the evening, he sat on his porch for a long time, watching dusk cover the town. He knew that the moment was approaching when the truth would come out. The only question was who would be the first to break. Peter, immersed in thought, recalled a conversation with one of Richard's neighbors who had mentioned seeing a late-night light in the Wilsons' study. It was a detail that should have been pointed out. Setting aside his coffee cup, he returned to his notes, knowing there was more work to be done. Peter Hart and Lily Rose returned to the Wilson house again, determined to tie all the threads of the investigation into a coherent whole. Small details that had seemed insignificant now took on new meaning. Peter was holding a file of crime scene reports and witness statements. "Lily, take a look at these statements from the neighbors," Hart said, his voice quiet but confident. Lily stepped closer and began to study the tapes. One of the neighbors claims to have seen Thomas Gray outside the Wilson house the night of the murder. Her eyes narrowed. "That confirms our hunch." Peter nodded, his gaze even more focused. Now we need to prove that their liaison wasn't just an affair, but part of a plan. Lily picked up another folder that contained phone call records. "Look, Peter here, Peter." There are several calls between Margaret and Thomas, made late at night a few days before the murder. Their frequency and timing indicate something more than just friendly conversations. Peter frowned. It confirms that they were in active contact and may have been discussing a plan. We need to see if there was any other evidence of their meetings. The detectives began questioning the nearest neighbors. One of them, an elderly man named Henry, recalled seeing Margaret and Thomas sitting in a car at the curb near the house late one night. I remember them talking. She looked very agitated, and he was trying to explain something to her, Henry said, his voice shaky but firm. This detail was an important piece of the puzzle that was sorely missing. Peter and Lily knew that witnesses were rarely able to see the full picture, but these pieces of information were beginning to add up into something clear. The detectives decided to question Margaret further. A tense silence hung in the living room where they met. Lily started the conversation, her voice sounding soft but determined. "Margaret, we are aware of your association with Thomas Gray. Could you explain why witnesses saw him outside your house and why you were meeting with him in secret?" Margaret turned pale, her eyes darting around the room, but she tried to keep her composure. "Thomas, he came to support me when Richard was being particularly aggressive." Her voice shook, but she tried to speak confidently. "We hadn't planned anything bad." Peter watched her reaction, noting the nervous movements and the tremor in her voice. "Margaret, your meetings and phone calls tell a different story. We found phone records of you discussing your plans with Thomas, and we got statements from neighbors who saw you together late at night. You have to understand, hiding the truth now will only make your situation worse." The words sounded like a warning. Margaret felt a lump of fear rise to her throat. Her gaze met Peter's, and she realized that there was no point in denying the obvious. Meanwhile, Thomas, learning of Margaret's reinterrogation, felt the ground go from under his feet. He knew he had left a trail behind him, and he realized that everything now depended on how long they could stay together. He decided to meet with Margaret in the evening to discuss their next steps, but he already knew that the detectives were too close to the truth. In the evening, Peter and Lily continued to study the case, paying attention to Henry's testimony and the phone records. Their suspicions were confirmed when they found a letter written by Thomas and carelessly hidden among the papers in his apartment. In it, he mentioned the pressure Richard was putting on Margaret and hinted at the need for decisive action. "Peter, this could be our key," Lily said, her eyes lighting up with anticipation. "We need to arrest Thomas and confront Margaret." The next day, Thomas was called to the station. He walked in with a wary look, but tried to look confident. Peter started the conversation calmly. "Thomas, we have witness statements that you were at the Wilson house on the night of the murder, and recordings of your conversations with Margaret. What do you have to say about that?" Thomas fell silent, realizing that lying would not save him. He sighed heavily and said, "Yes, I was there. Margaret and I wanted to discuss how she could get away from Richard. He was too hard on her." Lily, standing nearby, watched his every move, her intuition telling her that Thomas was close to a breakdown. "We know you were both in the house that night," Peter continued, emphasizing each word. "Your footprints on the windowsill and the prints on the glass indicate your involvement." Margaret, sitting behind the mirrored glass, heard every word and felt her heart clench with fear. She knew it would soon be over. "It's true," Margaret finally admitted when she was called to confront Thomas. "I wanted freedom, I wanted to get away from Richard, but he knew about us and threatened me. I saw no other way out." Peter looked at her with cold attention, but Lily noticed the tears running down her cheeks. It was more than just fear of exposure, it was pain and the realization of inevitability. The climax of the investigation came quickly. Under the weight of evidence and confessions, Margaret admitted that she had planned the murder with Thomas to get rid of Richard. She described how Richard had once threatened her in a rage, and that was the final straw. "You realize this is the end, Margaret?" Thomas whispered as they were led away to separate cells. The town was shocked. Emma couldn't believe what was happening. Her friend wasn't who she said she was. Frank sat silently in his office, realizing that he had lost not only his friend, but also his faith in human honesty. Peter and Lily, left alone, were silent for a long time. Finally, Lily spoke up. "Sometimes the truth destroys more than lies." Peter nodded, knowing that this wasn't just a case. It was a human drama that left scars on everyone involved. It had been several months since the high-profile Richard Wilson murder case, the town of Bayport, was slowly getting back to normal, but the scars left by the story would linger for a long time to come. Gossip and discussion had died down, but a shadow of distrust remained in people's hearts. Margaret was in the city jail awaiting trial. Her days were filled with monotony and loneliness, punctuated only by the occasional visit from a lawyer. Thinking back to the moments when she had taken the desperate step, Margaret could not shake the bitter feeling that her life was ruined forever. Thomas, despite trying to justify his actions, was also taken into custody. His confidence had melted away, and he looked like an exhausted man who had lost all hope. Peter Hart and Lily Rose continued their work. The Wilson case was one of the most difficult and painful of their careers. Peter often thought about how easily human destinies can be destroyed when the shadows of the past become too heavy. Lily tried not to dwell on the case, but every morning, passing by the newsstand, she noticed the headlines that reminded her of the tragedy. "Peter," she said one day, sitting down at her desk, "do you think they'll ever find peace?" Peter, rubbing his temples, looked at her with a tired smile. "In time, perhaps, but some stories stay with us forever." The town went on living. People laughed, worked, loved, and quarreled. But on every corner, someone knew that there were dark secrets lurking in quiet Bayport, and that those who crossed the line would never go back to their old lives. Life went on, but the pain of this story was a reminder that sometimes the price of freedom and love is too high.